Hello everybody, welcome to another video. Today it is the 25th of July. We have some really important developments beginning with the Kharkiv front to the north around Hlyboke. We'll go further south and analyze developments around New York and Toretsk, and then we'll finish off by looking at a lot of changes occurring along the Vovche riverfront and the Novomikhailivka-Kostyantynivka axis. And so something I've added in per popular demand is a new color to highlight the most recent Russian advances. And if Ukrainians advance in a certain region, then I'll use a light blue color to denote that. For now, I'm using a light yellow color to denote Russian advances, but I could change it if you guys prefer some other color that I have available at my disposal. But in any case, hopefully that makes it more clear for you guys. Here you could see the extent of the Russian advance in the village of Hlyboke. If you recall, it was mainly the 22nd Motorized Infantry Battalion of the 92nd Brigade that was involved in the localized counterattack that involved Bradleys and other infantry fighting vehicles breaking through the front line, advancing along these dachas in northern Liptsy, and then creating the spearhead directly into southwestern Hlyboke, and then also advancing along this road into the southeastern outskirts of the village, and then actually creating a lot of difficulties for the Russian defenders by advancing along this path over here, this horizontal path, and directly taking over the warehouses in the northern part of the village. Now, there have been a lot of drawbacks in the Ukrainian troop concentration in this region. A lot of units that were previously very active over here. Recently, we've seen less and less from them when it comes to footage, even when it comes to drone operations. A lot of this is due to the decreased emphasis on conducting counterattacks and more focus on preserving whatever they do still have under their control, trying to maintain a solid perimeter around Liptsy. But that's not to discount the fact that there has been a serious effort over the past month by this battalion to try to advance back into Hlyboke and take it over. Because Hlyboke, on the Russian perspective, it serves as a springboard. The next step from there is to immediately go south and attack towards Liptsy, which is the general goal in the sector because of how it acts as a glue connecting together various trenches, roads, and heights. So for the Ukrainians, that northern flank is so important, which is why they decided to go on the offensive in the first place. But even though this succeeded partially, the Russian forces that did actually hold on here did bog them down, despite definitely having less in terms of manpower. And there were a lot of compilations of Russian drone and artillery strikes responding to the Ukrainian threats. Now we actually have the Russians reversing those gains, taking over a region that's nearly 1 square kilometer in its area. And in terms of this extent of the advance, it's something in the ballpark of 1.1 kilometers westwards. And we know this because the Russian forces have been able to retake a lot of these trenches that were built originally by the Ukrainians that are centered around this warehouse. And here we have a video from July 25th. It's from the Aspid drone group, which is the drone unit of the 22nd Battalion, where it's just this rather long compilation going one by one, showing the drones dropping grenades onto individual Russian soldiers that are walking around these warehouses, hiding, crawling within trenches, near cars, all of that. And that's something that's always been the case in terms of Ukrainian drones dropping on individual soldiers. And now we just know that they've been able to yield casualties to the Russians in a new part of the front line, indicating the Russians were actually able to turn the tide. In terms of what's left for the Ukrainians, they may still have a foothold in this western outpost, but again, the fighting here really has gotten bogged down. And with this new Russian pressure from the north, it is going to be hard for the Ukrainians to maintain the connectivity in these final few ruins of a house. And by the way, it's going to be a big loss for the Ukrainians in this Liptsy sector that they no longer have the contributions of the Birds of Magyar drone group, which they really didn't have much of, that 414th Regiment of the Marine Corps. They were only at that front for several weeks, I believe, before being moved very recently to begin defending around the Pokrovsk direction, which we're going to get to later on in the video. But first, we're taking a stop in New York, where we do have some important developments beginning with Zalizhny, where again, the Russian forces, they made those initial forays very deep into the suburb, piercing several kilometers, and then withstanding several Ukrainian coordinated counterattacks utilizing tanks from the 32nd Mechanized Brigade engaging in street-to-street fighting. Despite a lot of Ukrainian reinforcements coming in, trying to hold the line over there, the Russian forces have been able to infiltrate even closer to Ukraine's impromptu second line of defense in this region, capturing this yellow shaded region. And we could actually look at the extent of the advance here. It amounts to something in the ballpark of 700 meters towards this really important diagonal road, which acts as the buffer between Zalizhny, the suburb, and then the southeasternmost approaches of Toretsk. Also, it is very, very close now, the Russian front line, to this really important slag heap overlooking the entire battlefield, where the Ukrainians are still located in the southwestern portion of the suburb, and is still overlooking the Russian-controlled parts of Zalizhny, even though they are still on relatively highly elevated regions. And so we know about this Russian advance because, again, you do still have a lot of Ukrainian activity. You do see a lot of videos from Zalizhny and Toretsk, for instance, of house-to-house combat. And so that's definitely going on a lot. But you do still have that drone aspect that recently the Ukrainians have beefed up. Now we see a video coming up from the Voron group, which is a part of the 100th Mechanized Brigade. That's very interesting to me because that unit, over the past month and a half, has made itself known in this defensive region in between Timofivka, Vozhizhenka, Baranivka, Novoalexandrivka. That's been its theater, and it's had a lot of coordination with the Voron group, which also did for a certain period of time defend around Krasnohorovka. But it appears now that at least some of its elements have been moved northeastwards to give the Ukrainians even further support in a region like Zalizhny, which I find to be really interesting because the situation really is dire in the regions that we just looked at around Vozhizhenka. And now it's being moved to this other key part of the front line. You're seeing rotation of units from one key sector to another, not from the rear to a key sector, which is a very important distinction when we're talking about troop rotations. And so it's not like this unit had any sort of rest or it's not had any sort of key contribution beforehand. It definitely did, and now is going to weaken the Ukraine defenders that were holding on over there that we're going to get to in a moment. And it also lends credence to my point that I was making yesterday in the video that elements of units are being broken up and then dispersed to areas that are dozens or scores of kilometers away from one another. So then you don't have a unified brigade or even battalion headquarters in some cases if it's a drone unit. And then they're left on their own with less organization, lower caliber of staff, not getting proper assignments, not getting proper resource allocation, not being able to interact with nearby units as well. And you can see that manifesting with a lot of the reinforcements that are hastily moving into a certain region only based on the numbers that we see, the number of men, but not taking into account the important context of how much of the entire unit was moved in. Is it just a certain element? And are we breaking up these units for a long time? What does that do to cohesion? Those are legitimate questions that really are causing issues in a region like this. But yeah, you can see how the Russian forces, they are continuing to push with a rather modest amount of men in this region. They're not really redirecting forces from any other part of the front line for the New York operation, which is what makes it unique compared to other Russian offensive activities, because in other sectors, like on the Kharkiv front, there was movement of some units, like airborne units, but here there's basically been none. All the units that are engaged were either previously stationed here or had been resting following fights around this part of the front line, around Avdiivka, for instance. And so now you have a lot of the attacks that are occurring, frontline attacks from house to house, that of course yield higher casualties, being conducted by the Veterans PMC, made up of a lot of members of the Donetsk region that are currently under Russian control, and also former Wagner mercenaries, and further south, as we talked about before, other DPR units, not even from the pre-2022 Russian unit composition structure. And then going further south, we do have this really small shaded region per reports from Deep State, not a geolocation. If we look at the extent of the advance, it's the Russians pushing 600 meters westwards here. And again, let me say that this blue perimeter here is not under Russian control. It's just a mistake that I can't edit out. But what you should know is that the Russian forces for the past 3 days have been pushing along this specific tree line, trying to expand the sort of western flank of this salient that the Russians created into New York, trying to provide some sort of support for whatever forces they have in Yurivka. And I think more broadly, this is being done in order to secure the entirety of these heights that are in between Yurivka and Pantelymonivka, whatever this village is called. So the Russians are getting close to it. I don't think they're going to really look into assaulting it head on right now, but the point would be to secure some of these hills. And at that point, you're overlooking 1, 2, 3, 4 villages along this line that are also involved in providing cover for this Ukrainian horizontal defense line that leads into New York and is filled to the brim with defensive structures. Now, moving on to the Pokrovsk direction, we're going to begin by receiving an update about the situation just between Pokrovsk and Hlyboke, because there was a lot of circulation from the Ukrainian media space, especially from deep state surrounding an alleged encirclement that occurred for several Ukrainian observation posts along this height over here. I think it's height 269.3, maybe I'm wrong, or 0.9. I might be mistaken. But in any case, it's this local hill that overlooks Hlyboke and is basically an extension of the hills along this rail line in the ones just south of Novoalexandrivka. Deep State's narrative surrounding it is that you had this Russian flanking operation occur as they pushed towards Pokrovsk further south along the rail line, and then also as they breached the Ukrainian defenses in Hlyboke, and then just continued pressing towards Ivanivka, Lysychne, and Timofivka, and it left the defenders of the 1st and 3rd Battalions of the 31st Mechanized Brigade in this very precarious spot where the brigade commander did not allow them to withdraw. He told them to hold the line even after it became clear that their flanks were severely compromised. And of course, they heeded those orders at the time. They didn't actually retreat for a rather long period of time, and that's when Deep State began to vocalize about the issue, and that occurred around yesterday, around the 24th. Now Deep State is coming out on the 25th and alleging that despite never receiving a breakout order from this particular pocket, the 2 battalions or whatever elements are stuck over here, they were able to coordinate with whatever Ukrainian forces are located outside. Maybe they're from the 31st Mechanized Brigade, maybe they're from the 110th Brigade, or from whatever is left of the 100th Brigade, and especially worked with drone crews. So I'm assuming Birds of Magyar would have been some sort of element within that, worked with those air reconnaissance units and with artillery to try to get out. And that what Deep State is claiming is that a large majority of the troops that were within here, which they never gave us a number, they really didn't give us a number, which I really wanted to know, but I would assume probably it's in the dozens, maybe high dozens if you're thinking about it, were able to get out without being killed. And so we can't confirm any of this because it's all coming from, a conduit from Deep State, not directly from the soldiers themselves. And even then, you can't really take what they're saying at face value, especially because we don't have video footage of any of this. I would really like to see some to, get an idea of how the breakout operation commenced, how they were able to push through this pocket over here and advance like 2 kilometers until they reached this highway over here, and doing so under Russian fire. It really is interesting, and obviously it's possible. It's not the first time there have been pockets, and usually these pockets aren't massive, like with hundreds of men. Sometimes they are, like with Azovstal, where you had thousands, or with the actual factory in Severodonetsk, where you did have hundreds. In this case, it's way smaller, and it happens every now and then, especially when the Russian forces are able to compromise a certain part of the Ukrainian line and then just run full steam ahead forward without even directly engaging with the Ukrainians in their stronghold. But of course, it is just basic media literacy not to take anything that's being said, especially by that sort of party, at face value. I still do use the changes to the map, though, just to give us a general idea of where the Russians are now operating. And so what Deep State's saying is that the Russian forces have been able to advance around 900 meters. Their implication would be that once the Ukrainians got out, the Russian forces just basically solidified control over that height in the nearby fields. And so I'm assuming this gray zone over here is eventually just going to be marked as under Russian control. It probably is, given the entire state of events, which would mean the new Ukrainian sort of stable line would be along this road at Timofivka. And it really is not a stable line. It's on a valley overlooked by the Russian positions that were just taken along this height. It's also flanked from the south, where Russians have a large presence in Pokrovsk, according to Deep State. And this gives us actually some additional topics to talk about, because we of course know about this Russian advance here along this sort of ring just south of Hlyboke, where the Russian forces really have improved their positions. in a way that is threatening to nearby um, basically villages on floodplains or on tributaries like Ivanivka, Lysychnya, Timofivka. All of them are under extreme danger at the moment due to this development along this rectangle. But an even bigger issue is regarding the situation in Pokrovsk. What Deep State's saying is that in some Russian advances along the rail line, they're utilizing between 40 to 60 men advancing along those windbreaks. That's hard for me to believe because even in the photos they're showing us, it's like a dozen men advancing together. And it could be more, of course, that we're not seeing in the same frame. But again, in most of the videos that we're seeing, it is rather small numbers that are initially pushing through. Those could be DRGs, and maybe once the DRGs make it into a certain heated area, then that opens the floodgates, and then you have larger companies pushing in. Because what Deep State is now arguing is that in Pokrovsk, there are 3 companies worth of Russian soldiers, which would just be an insane amount for such a small village when you think about it. This is like a village that spans like 1 kilometer when you look at it. And so a company that could range between dozens, several dozen men, and 200 men. I would say if it's 3 companies, then it's of course leaning towards the dozens in terms of size. But then again, that could still be, when you combine it together, 100 plus men in total operating within this village. If that's the case, which you can't really say for sure, but Deep State is complaining about it. And the reason why they're complaining about it is because they are saying that there aren't sufficient artillery reserves to properly target all of those groupings as they're pushing forward, which is absolutely the case, regardless of whether Deep State is correct or not, because the vast majority of the activities we see are coming from FPV drones, and it is a means of replacing the just complete lack of artillery. So you might as well just use the individual drones to just go and pick off Russian soldiers one by one. Now, regardless of the size of the Russian garrison over here, they are still advancing at a really fast pace when you're comparing it to the months of just slow grinding throughout Avdiivka and then afterwards in the Durna River. The Vovche River front really is breaking, and the Russians are exposing deep holes over here despite a lot of fortifications being built. It doesn't matter if the quality of the units is just disorganized, disoriented, lacking proper manpower. So here you can see it's like 3 square kilometers captured. It's a Russian advance from Pokrovsk southwestwards about 800 kilometers or meters, taking over the vast majority of Vovche already. Something that, of course, was inevitable once Pokrovsk was taken because it's just connected to Vovche, just an extension of it. And even more importantly, advancing along the rail line, advancing about 1.7 kilometers southwards along the rail line, meaning that the Russian forces now have control of this really important embankment overlooking Ivanivka and Vesele. And these are the specific villages where you do have the Ukrainian units beginning to withdraw towards, trying to at least form a line using the embankments to defend them, but they can't even have that on their eastern flank. And you already have this movement of Russian forces, probably in small numbers, 1.2 kilometers northwards towards this horizontal road that connects to Pokrovsk and the rail line, and basically is just south of Ivanivka. And so you do have this big threat now to the southern flank of the village, and it really does, as a whole, pose a massive threat to this eastern flank of Hlyboke, which is it's more so of a mid-term goal, but the Russians are getting so close that it does have to be discussed now that the Russians are only about 5 kilometers away from Hlyboke, which is a really important logistics hub on the road to Mirnohrad and Pokrovsk. So of course, keep that in mind with all of these Russian advances around here. And then at the same time, look at how the Russians are advancing southwards from Vovche. Keep in mind that they're pushing towards a lot of the Ukrainian defense line that is built directly to the west, on the west bank of the river. And the entire goal is to hold that line for as long as possible to then build up even further westwards in lines of defense towards Pokrovsk and Mirnohrad. But that can't be done if the Russians have already infiltrated northwards and can now flank all of those positions and all of the rear villages like Zelane over here or Zavitne going further south. And yeah, that's just a very precarious situation. Looking further southwards, the Russian forces are now beginning to chip away at the remaining Ukrainian holdings on the east bank of the river, taking over nearly 1 square kilometer of land, basically just this open field region south of Novoslivka Persha. And you're going to begin seeing now the Russian advance through the rest of this open area, spanning another 4 kilometers in the western direction. Now, moving southwards to the Kostyantynivka front, we really have an insane update from here. Let's click on it. It's a Russian advance amounting to 2 square kilometers, but just highlighting it as a Russian advance would be pretty dishonest given what actually unfolded in the video that I'm going to link to you guys that you could click on my interactive map. And here it's an advance of 1.5 kilometers northwards and an advance westwards of about 1.6 kilometers. The geolocation is over here showing the furthest extent of the Russian advance, and it was recorded July 24th, actually, not 25th. And you could see the Russian forces, their vehicles were able to make it to the southeastern tip of Kostyantynivka for the first time ever. But let's actually get the full context surrounding the story. So yesterday, the 79th Brigade, they released this very long post where they claimed that there was a significant attack conducted by the Russian forces, the largest one that they had ever endured, that they were able to spot in the early hours of the 24th during the dawn period, a large assortment of Russian vehicles amassing several kilometers east of the front line, probably along this rail line, Olenivka, that's where they begin, then advance along fields westwards. Now, the 79th claimed that the Russians utilized a total of 57 vehicles in a singular assault, which is not verified, and I would really like to see the full extent of an overhead view of all those vehicles advancing in tandem if it were the case. They claimed that the Russians utilized 11 tanks, 45 combat vehicles, and the idea of using so many more BMPs and MTLBs would be because, of course, they're stored full with infantry, and you want to dismount them. So that would be a very serious ground-based assault to try to ensure a large breakthrough. And then also the utilization of at least one Terminator tank, which we barely have seen during the fighting, but that's what's being claimed by the 79th, in addition to 12 motorcycles being used. And in terms of the motorcycles, I'd assume they're leading the pack, trying to reach certain positions in tree lines or in houses very quickly, to just get the groundwork sort of laid and prevent the Ukrainians from setting up positions on the front line, trying to undermine their defense in that region. That would be the logic of it all. And so the Russian attacks didn't occur along the same line. There were various vectors. I assume that based on the geolocation, some were coming from Novomykhailivka directly, some along this vector, and then some coming directly from the south and advancing northwards. And so the compilation video itself, there's 3 main columns that it records. The first frame shows 8 Russian vehicles in close proximity to one another along one of these tree lines here. Of course, trying to stick by to it. The logic would be to dismount troops over there, especially if the vehicle suffers severe damage. And then another frame shows 4 Russian vehicles making that attempted landing into southeastern Kostyantynivka. And then they pass by the 2 destroyed Russian vehicles in the process that were probably destroyed earlier. And so you could see 4 that actually make it all the way to the southeastern tip and begin to fire directly towards Ukrainian positions in the houses, or at least further west over here. And you could see some key characteristics. A lot of them have anti-jamming systems. A lot of them have cope cages, and rather large ones. In that case, some of them have some sort of camouflage. The tanks, some of them are turtle tanks, not all of them. But the turtle tanks did make a comeback in this specific incident. You also had just generally a lot of slat armor put on these tanks and on the armored vehicles. And the leading tank in a lot of these columns also had a mine roller, which makes sense because the sappers of the Ukrainian defenders did put a lot of mines along this path, because it is pretty predictable at this point. The Russians have tried to advance along here for 3-4 weeks at this point. So in terms of the claims being made by the Ukrainians, they could at least partially be substantiated in terms of vehicle losses. I think I saw like 5 being either running over a mine and then suffering some sort of massive blast as a result, or artillery targeting them, or drones, ATGM crews, whatever it may be. Those were the 4 elements mentioned in the Ukrainian defense. And then in terms of the Ukrainian claims to the actual amount that it destroyed, they claimed it to have destroyed 6 tanks and 7 of the BMPs that housed infantry, and then all of the 12 motorcycles they claimed they were able to destroy. And I guess you could say that some of the infantry that were within those BMPs probably would have suffered casualties as a result if it's receiving a direct hit. And so then the claim made by the 79th Brigade is that they were able to kill 40 Russian soldiers and wound 37 of them. And so, again, that would not be half, but it would be nearing half of the 200 force for, going by their numbers. I can't see all of that based on the footage they posted, which maybe they'll post more. But what they did post was the aftermath of a lot of Russian infantry that made it to the southeastern corner of Kostyantynivka with the hope of reaching it and probably getting a deep foothold here, not being able to do that, and then dismounting on their own or in small groups in these tree lines, in these fields, in Ukrainian trenches, and then being picked off by drones. Drones, either FPVs or most cases actually grenades being dropped towards them. And so then in those cases, there definitely were casualties. And you could say it's in the tens, but I don't know if you could say it's in the 40s based on what we saw in the actual video. So it's not conclusive. But what I'll say is that even if you don't take the 79th Brigade at their word, the footage they showed definitely proves that the Russians did substantially increase their amount in ferocity in these attacks compared to the previous ones that we saw over the past month. And so definitely there has been a concerted Russian effort to breach the village of Kostyantynivka. For now, it has failed. They've been able to shore up more control in the southeastern fields, but they have not been able to actually take it. If they had taken it, then we would have seen the geolocation for the troops actually landing within and not just fighting with vehicles shooting right outside of it. And really, this video footage does dispel some myths from this front, with people believing that the Russians had run out of BMP-2s or BMP-3s or a various assortment of tanks that did make their presence known during this assault per video footage and per the Ukraine's own statements. And the next day, on the 25th of July, the 79th Brigade claimed to have repelled another attack utilizing 3 tanks and 13 armored fighting vehicles, again filled with infantry. And what they're claiming is that during this most recent assault, they were able to destroy 1 tank, 1 armored vehicle, and 1 BMP, utilizing artillery, drone drops, and also a lot of the artillery being cluster munitions, per the footage that I saw. And then also they claim to have killed 23 Russian soldiers during the activity today and wounded 29. And so it shows that even after such a massive Russian assault, if we're taking their word for it and looking at the footage, they were able to continue it the next day, albeit at a lesser extent. It really does show that they do have an intention of directly stepping over here, but definitely the 79th Brigade has been formidable when it comes to pushing back those large-scale assaults. And so that's all I have for today. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Goodbye.